Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Today's podcast is a collaboration with Consensus, the market-leading blockchain technology company. Given its core position in the Ethereum ecosystem, we're able to bring you the most captivating industry insiders, from technologists and entrepreneurs to designers and creatives from all around the world. So join us for inspiring conversations on the future of finance, crypto, and what is making up the new decentralized web. Localize is a language technology B2B software as a service company, and it's on track to redefine this category. More than 1,800 companies, including MasterCard, Lemonade, Revolut, ABN AMRO, Crypto.com, they all use Localize to manage product translations. On the 13th of May, check out their LinkedIn page and website for more information and details. That's localize.com, LOKALISE.com. And with that, let's start the episode. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited for today's conversation with Robert. It's going to be an amazing journey through decentralized finance and, of course, focus on Compound. Robert is the CEO of Compound Labs and the founder of the Compound Protocol. So we'll talk about how that has developed, what it has grown to, and everything that will continue to evolve out of the space. So with that, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I love just getting into our larger story by opening up your journey, your career journey from traditional finance to entrepreneurship and to crypto. Maybe if you could just get us in that way, and then we'll open up the decentralized finance themes even more from there.
Yeah, great. So I actually started my career in finance, long before there was a concept of decentralized finance, working at a bank, forecasting interest rates and doing interest rate planning and liquidity planning for the bank. And that's what actually exposed me to the, interest rate markets in the first place. And this was during 2007, 2008, 2009, which was actually the most interesting time in recent, financial history, because it was a time of great turmoil and uncertainty. And from that experience, I was able to see a lot of the inner workings of the financial system and the things that were working and the things that weren't working. The liquidity crisis of that era was really created through opacity of the financial system. It was created through these like deeply interwoven and non-compartmentalized financial markets and products. And that's where I began my career, was with this sort of like great financial trauma that our country was going through. From there,
I can absolutely empathize with the trauma being this foundational moment. For me, it was Lehman Brothers was my first gig out of school, and watching that melt down with every single investment manager saying it was a fantastic time to buy Lehman stock was just deeply educational. I want to ask you about interest rates. You said you did interest rate planning. What is an interest rate, and what were the interest rate markets that you were looking at?
Yeah, so a bank does two things. One, it borrows from depositors or those who are providing the liquidity to the institution. And the second thing that it does is it lends those funds out to earn a return. And the basic business model is borrowing short term to lend long term. That's fundamentally the way most banks operate. And they're lending at a higher interest rate than they're borrowing at. And that generates income. And it's a very tried and true business model. It's been happening for a really long time. And that's dangerous because oftentimes the liability to customers is short term. It goes up and down based on overnight rates or what the Federal Reserve is dictating at any given moment. And they're oftentimes lending long, where, their assets are of a fixed duration, whether it's months, years, decades in the case of some assets. Mortgages are often, 10-year assets. And that creates risks. And those risks are really tied to whether interest rates are going up or down at a given moment and whether they're going up and down faster or slower than people anticipate. Now, in 2007, 2008, 2009, interest rates changed a lot and very rapidly and in ways that nobody had predicted. So it was a complicated time to be a bank.
That's that's a really generous framing for what it was like to be a bank, I think, in that moment. I feel like the names like Countrywide, I think, are certainly etched in history as having a lot of trouble getting through that period and really thinking and building long-term businesses. So it's very interesting to me, the idea also of risk and how so much of the traditional system is a derivative on top of an interest rate that's, as you said, dictated by the Federal Reserve. And so maybe that's a piece that we can come back to once we start touching on other models for the discovery of risk and the pricing of risk. Okay, so you're coming out of this experience in financial services, and I think you're starting to look at investing and entrepreneurship after that, right?
Yeah. And following, my time in finance, I became a software founder with a good friend of mine. And it was sort of this like divergence away from, finance, which had gone through, as we discussed, like a very turbulent moment. And I wanted sort of like some fresh air and a change of pace. And so a friend and I decided to start a software company that was focused on building privacy software for consumers. And this was my first experience with entrepreneurship. We moved out to California, raised some venture capital, and went through the learning curve of building something and distributing it to the world. And that was my first experience as a builder. It was really interesting because it was actually in that market building privacy software that I started to intersect with crypto just a little bit, where there was, a lot of customers of our software that were also interested in Bitcoin very early on. This was, we started this company in 2011 and we operated it until 2014. And so we were able to see from, our clients some similar interest with crypto. And from there, I saw Bitcoin, dabbled in mining it, mostly as a weekend hobby, but never really took it that seriously. The finance guy in me, or the former finance guy, was skeptical of Bitcoin generally as a currency or as an asset that could displace larger traditional currencies. And so I saw crypto, but was a bit dismissive at the time.
And I think that's a really common experience too, especially around the early claims that the Bitcoin community was trying to make. And it was hard to see the exponential curve at that stage. And, only now in retrospect, everything kind of clicks together. I'm curious about that first startup experience and that focus on privacy, which of course today is a key component of our space. But that focus on privacy, what did you discover people really mean by privacy? What is it that they want? I've always struggled to put a point on how people really think about it and what they're willing to trade for it. I'm curious whether anything of that nature came out through your experience there.
Yeah, it's interesting because, the privacy market has been around for about 10 years, whether it's through VPNs or software that removes sort of public information, whether it's through online activity or the meat space world. Like, people do generally across the board love the idea of privacy in what they do. When it comes to sort of like paid products, it's actually really interesting because the commercial market for privacy is actually relatively smaller than you would expect. And, it's interesting because I think this touches on a lot of different ideas, but I think that there's a sense of individuality and wanting to protect your ability as an individual to do what you want without external judgment or repercussion. Whether or not it's, anything malicious or what, I think people just like this sense of individuality and not being judged. And I think that's sort of like the root of privacy. There's a lot of people who say like, oh, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. And I think that's completely incorrect. I think like you can just want to have your business be your business, not anybody else's. And there's a comfort in that. That's sort of existential. And so, this touches on some of the early themes of cryptocurrency as well, where it's hard to define exactly why somebody would want a pseudonymous currency or even a completely private one, even if they're doing nothing wrong. And obviously, we've seen sort of like malicious early use cases of like anonymity in crypto. A lot of it was used in sort of very dark markets, but a lot less nowadays. And so I think this will continue to evolve as a concept. I think, we as a society are constantly sort of like searching for what makes us comfortable. And I think money is an area that most people are oftentimes deeply uncomfortable about. And so new technologies that can change our experience with money and finance are a positive thing for society.
There are so many interesting parts of this concept to try and pull apart. People are very curious in sort of their utility functions, right? Like in the economic modeling of a person, it doesn't really work. And we've gotten some super weird outcomes as a result of that. So, for example, at the margin for every individual, I think on average, Facebook makes maybe, I'm going to get this wrong, but maybe somewhere between $3 to $5 per person from their data. And so the idea that a large monopoly tech company would pay you that amount back, for every individual, nobody's going to make that trade. The convenience of the free product at an individual level is so much higher than whatever individual economic value that tech company is generating per person. But then on the aggregate, it is this incredible tragedy where it's billions of value for that data for the company, and there's just no collective action on the other side. You could also think about it as a bundle of rights. And I love the framing of, even if you have nothing to hide, there is an injustice if somebody breaches your ability to not be looked at. It's disenfranchising to not be able to protect yourself and not be able to say, this is mine. So in many ways, participating in the crypto markets, as well as kind of these earlier attempts at giving people their rights back, are about just getting prepared and having self-worth as an individual. And I think it's just such a philosophical space that it's interesting to try and be commercial in it.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And like the microeconomics 101 textbook would say that this is a case of like externalities, whether it's sort of privacy or in your example of Facebook, or in a traditional example, sort of pollution. You could have a factory that makes a lot of money for itself by polluting, and it inflicts a small cost on many people. But it's not enough for those many people to necessarily get up in arms and stop the problem. And this has sort of defined a lot of different markets. And Facebook is the same way, where they can make individually a lot of profit by inflicting a small externality harm on others, but not enough for people to change the structure or regulate the market in some way yet. So it's definitely interesting from an economic perspective. And I think in a distant future, it's possible that sort of crypto economic networks could change those types of economics, because that's the thing that crypto does best, is it is an incentive system, but we'll see.
Yeah, and I think it's unavoidable that capital appreciation has been kind of wedded to the crypto asset dream. And so that marginal decision by a single person that is weighing, even if they had the option to get the $2 from Facebook and go private or get everything for free but sell their data, if you all of a sudden flip that $2 to 10,000 and you wed the idea of money into it itself, then you can have large scale population wide changes. And so coming out of your experience as an entrepreneur and seeing Ethereum and what Bitcoin was turning into around 2015, 2016, sort of, what was your take? What was your first pass at the possible there?
Yeah, so I was somebody that generally passed on Bitcoin. I always had like a little bit of Bitcoin, but it was never anything that was like deeply interesting to me as a person. And then I have this extremely vivid memory of reading the Ethereum white paper at the time. And it was actually very similar to when I first got into Bitcoin, which is I was actually deeply skeptical of Ethereum. This was before Ethereum launched. It was before like Homestead. It was like, a moment where I was like, wow, this is too complicated and it's never going to launch. And, I was sort of dismissive at first. And then the next deeply vivid memory I have is having not paid attention to Ethereum for a while, watching the DAO, which was really the first complex smart contract on Ethereum, blow up. And this was deeply moving for me for two very opposite reasons. One was that Ethereum shipped, and it was possible to build extremely complex interactions on top of it using a smart contract, which was like completely mind-blowing to me. And the second was that it was one of the first examples of an extremely large amount of financial assets being managed quasi-autonomously. And both of these things were like radical eye-opening moments for me, where I thought to myself, holy cow, there's something here that either didn't resonate with me or like I was missing. But I think that this technology is ready to be used in a whole spectrum of ways that I can't even fathom yet. And that's when I became almost like a light switch going off, like deeply passionate about exploring what was possible with Ethereum. and smart contracts. And that was sort of like the light bulb for me.
How did that lead you to be a founder? There's different ways to get engaged, and it was a pretty spectacular moment, 2017, and it was also a very confusing moment because, especially if you come into the space with skepticism, there was a lot of stuff going on that in retrospect wasn't super productive. There were lots of projects that were making claims, and you had to kind of navigate through a lot of people that weren't really there to make anything, but rather to participate in a theatrical production about who they are. But you became a founder, and you've created one of the core pieces of this next generation economy. What was it like to sort of make that choice and then stick to it through the crypto winter environment? Was difficult, but even more broadly, it was like a fairly hostile storytelling about crypto for multiple years until we really got to about a year ago.
Yeah. So here's the full timeline. So the DAO blew up, and it was like the moment where I got really excited about Ethereum. And following this, there weren't nearly as many interesting smart contracts being developed on Ethereum. I remember early versions of Token Trader, which was like sort of around the same time before Ether Delta. And there was a couple projects launching really interesting smart contracts, but the ecosystem wound up relatively soon thereafter being hijacked by ICOs. And I was a very curious but passive sort of participant in the ecosystem. I watched all of these ICOs in early 2017. And the only thing that people were really using smart contracts for was to create token contracts and to create crowd sale contracts, mostly just forking them and changing a name or two. And this was actually like deeply saddening and disturbing to me because, I got to see this technology, which the DAO to me was one of these truly groundbreaking moments, get sidetracked by kind of like purposeless greed. And the smart contract technology that I was sort of like in love with was not being used for really that much that was interesting. And I almost wanted to start Compound out of, I don't want to say out of like, an opposition to the ICO era, but out of a desire to build something incredibly interesting using smart contracts that couldn't exist otherwise, not to create a token, not to do an ICO. But it was like 2017. It was like, I wanted to build the coolest thing you could possibly build with a smart contract. And that's when the sort of idea for Compound took hold. My background was in interest rates. And I said, with my co-founder of Compound, I said, can we build interest rate market for crypto assets using this new technology to enable something that doesn't really exist yet? This was the late summer of 2017. And the answer was, we don't know. We don't know if it's technologically possible. We don't know if it'll work. We don't know if there's demand for it. We don't know whether, this is like technologically feasible. And so we quit our jobs and became founders of a project to really just explore this, to hack on Solidity for a couple of months and prove out early ideas of like what was technologically feasible and what wasn't. We found that like certain things that you would think would be easy were extremely hard, and some things that you thought were hard were impossible. And, it forced us to actually build a product that looked differently than what we had originally anticipated. The original visions for Compound were that it would look almost like a decentralized, autonomous bank. And what we found was that there was like technological limitations that forced us down different paths. The early markets we actually didn't anticipate would be a spot interest rate, spot being, there's no duration. We actually originally thought that Compound would be entirely, fixed duration instruments, like you could earn interest for a 2-month period, not a 0-second 1-block period. And, it sort of tipped our hand in ways that we didn't anticipate, but we decided to build it. We raised a very small amount of like angel and friends and family funding in 2017. And then in 2018, as we started to enter a bear market, 2 things occurred to us. One was that this was going to be technologically possible. We were able to build in a couple months a working end-to-end prototype of a smart contract grounded autonomous interest rate market with a really ugly looking user interface using Web3 on top of it. And we also thought that the market was headed towards, a somewhat dark moment. By early 2018, the former bubble in prices had started to pop. Prices were going down across the board. A lot of the people who are in the space to like make a quick buck were rapidly leaving. And we decided that we were going to raise a venture capital round. And what we pitched to prospective investors was that this might take a really long time and that we didn't know how long it would take, one, for lots of assets to be issued on a blockchain, and 2, for there to be a demand for interest rates for these assets on a blockchain. And we knew that eventually this would become a thing, but we didn't know if it was going to be 1 month or 1 year or 1 decade before it did. So we raised a lot more money than we thought we needed for a small team. We raised what we were hoping would be like 5 years of runway because we didn't know if it would take us 5 years for a market to sort of form. The phrase DeFi had not been invented yet. This was like, we were one of a couple projects in early 2018, mid 2018, by this point, even developing sort of like financial products like this. And, we just didn't know what to expect. And from there, we basically just put ourselves in a position to make it through a bear market that might last years. We anticipated that we'd probably be releasing multiple versions of Compound, iterating, improving, experimenting for years to come. And we were really lucky that when in September of 2018, when we first launched the very first version of Compound, there was a small market, there was a small amount of demand, and it started to work. This coincided with the growth of stablecoins on Ethereum around the same time, which was extremely fortunate. The market for something like Compound without stablecoins is very different than the market for Compound with stablecoins. And it turns out that stablecoins were like a killer app that sort of came into fruition at the exact same time, which made the whole market work in a way we just didn't anticipate. And growth started to occur much more rapidly than we had anticipated, mostly because of stablecoins. So by the end of 2018, the numbers that we had in Compound were at the time shocking to us. I'll probably get this wrong a little bit, but like MakerDAO had like 30 or $40 million of DAI, and like Compound had like $20 million of assets in it. And we thought these numbers were huge. We thought they were off the charts large. And it really surprised us how large these markets were at that time. And this is obviously before today. We're just 2 years later. The markets are 100 times the size or more. But this was a really like exciting moment because this was like some of the very earliest DeFi use cases that went live and started to attract initial adoption.
Absolutely. I want to meditate on a couple of things that you've said, which is it was not always clear that Ethereum would be so dollar denominated. And it felt quite uncertain, especially because all sorts of parties were trying to characterize what tokens are and what their attributes are and so on, whether they're currencies or assets. And there were so many faux theories attributed to different assets and whether they were going to be the medium of exchange and whether they were going to be the unit of account and so on. And like you say, I think it's both the actual value of the assets, the stablecoin assets, that's helpful. But I think especially denominating the economy in a way that many more people could understand was a way to de-risk participation for a whole lot of people. The other thing I wanted to think about for a second is going back to that point about what is an interest rate and what is risk. And for me, the closest analogy, and I know it's sort of dangerous to say out loud, but the closest analogy is kind of like securities lending, where you might go to a Morgan Stanley capital markets desk and you want to borrow some Apple stock. And so you would pay them an interest rate to get that Apple stock. And then you do whatever you want with it in the capital markets. And then you pay back your position. And that's quite a different interest rate market from the one you described at Discover, which was sort of you're taking an underwriting risk and it's not necessarily collateralized. And it also is a function of the interest rate set by a centralized entity like the Federal Reserve, which prices the entire economy. And in Ethereum, Maker wanted to be or positioned itself as a central bank, which I don't think played out in that particular way. But how did you move towards the idea that you would have these essentially floating interest rate pools of capital across different token pairs? It's not necessarily obvious that that was going to be the killer feature that it became. Like, how did you discover that?
Yeah, it's actually really funny how we discovered it. So we didn't anticipate that there would be like this short-term floating interest rate that we would use. And it actually came from a computation problem early on when we were building Compound. So like there was a version 0 that we never released. And what wound up happening was we originally started by having users with different positions, right? Where they could be earning 6% for 2 months, or they had like a very specific position. And we found that iterating over a large number of users was extremely complicated. And so we came up with this very simple mechanism early on, which you can sort of see in the code of Compound V1, which is immortalized on the Ethereum blockchain forever, where we found that the easiest way to iterate over huge numbers of users was by using what we called an interest rate index, where it basically denominated the growth of a balance over time and applied it equally to all users uniformly. And what this did was it meant that all users could earn interest at the exact same rate, whether there was one user or 1 trillion users or whatever the blockchain could handle, and that all users' balances would grow in the same proportion over time. And this was actually really, really cool because one, it allowed us to have an interest rate that changed dynamically at all times. So the interest rate could go up every single block and you could sort of like calculate the impact on end users without any increase in gas. And the second was that all users were interacting with a protocol and not another user. So a lot of early experiments in interest rates on a blockchain where user A lends money to user B. And we took a radically different approach out of necessity, which was all users interact directly with the protocol and supply assets to one big pool of liquidity, not another user, peer to protocol. And this was mostly done to like facilitate just the computational limitations we had. And it worked phenomenally. At this point, so many teams in the space have sort of learned from that initial work. Now pooled liquidity and peer to protocol liquidity and using indices to accumulate balances across any number of users simultaneously are like standard DeFi toolkit mechanisms that developers have that have now found themselves in pretty much every product in DeFi. And it's mostly because like these are the things that are able to enable applications at scale. And it's not what we originally envisioned. We originally envisioned doing something very different. It was that this was the path of least resistance to actually launching an application. And it's worked phenomenally. And, in a lot of ways, I think peer-to-protocol liquidity is better than peer-to-peer, and that having a short-term interest rate is better than having a term interest rate. And so it's taken hold, and I think a lot of other projects have followed in the footsteps.
There's a fun analogy to the compression that images had to go through in the early internet days, when you had to pixelate things for them to be displayed on websites fast enough, and you're turning things into like 16 color GIFs, or even if you think to early video game culture with the Nintendo color scheme and pixelated graphics. And 40 years later, CryptoPunks are using that pixelated aesthetic. And there's a whole essentially open field of art and culture and things that people value under this specific set of constraints. And it was a hardware constraint at the moment, but ended up creating really this open ocean that people have an emotional connection to, and the technology limitations gone, but still it becomes kind of this language. And so for me, we're in this period where we still have so much constraint in the blockchain itself and in the ability to execute lots and lots of code. Like comparing to AI, for example, we're in the first 10 years, we're not in the 50th year when you can just raw power some neural network and recognize faces. We're still in this really constrained moment, but that moment is creating the type of innovation that you describe. And you can, exactly as you say, you can trace that innovation to every single successful DeFi protocol, starting with Compound and with Uniswap and all the mechanism design that supports the market function. How do you think about that technological constraint lifting, whether that is through layer twos or side chains or Compound gateway? Can you talk a little bit about what will happen to the mechanism design as the constraints go away, and then what role you think either the protocol or the DAO should be playing in creating ways to lift those restraints?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think fundamentally, a blockchain, no matter how good it is going to have different constraints than other systems. On Ethereum, storage and computation are incredibly expensive. For good reason, because you have a decentralized process to agree on them. For every node or one day every validator that exists, you have, in duplication, all of the memory, all of the compute. You have lots of computers all doing the same thing that in a centralized system, one computer can do, right? And it means that, especially when we were developing Compound, and probably forever in a lot of ways, you have a lot more constraints around just like what is possible economically in terms of storage or compute. And that's not really going to change. It's possible that over time you can have like large systems that are interwoven where you can move sort of the compute or the storage elsewhere and reference it and build like more complicated sort of computing systems. But I think all of these things won't fundamentally change the fact that developing an application on a blockchain is radically different than developing one, on a server. That is just hosted out of AWS on one server, right? Where storage and compute is pretty cheap at the end of the day for an application. And so I think those constraints will always exist. I think those constraints forced, at least when we were developing Compound early on, to make some really interesting trade-offs that in some ways are better than had there not been constraints. If we were unconstrained, we'd probably have a system that wouldn't be as useful. I mean, that's the sort of irony. And it's possible that when you even lift the constraints, that those constraints have developed a more efficient economic system. You might, if you had unlimited computing resources, if you were like the central bank of a country, you might actually build a model that looks similar to Compound because it's unbelievably efficient. And that efficiency was only sort of created out of necessity. Whereas if you didn't have those constraints, you might design an inefficient system. So I find it really interesting. And I think it'll be a long discovery process to figure out like what sort of jumps off blockchains and what makes it into traditional computing platforms. But I think as you have all these like layer twos, you have more sidechains, you have all these things that'll sort of like lightly abate the constraints, but not materially, not transformatively. I think as a developer, it's like going back in time by 40 years to software engineers in the 70s, where like they really had to think through a lot of the decisions they were making around storage and compute to do things efficiently. And I think even if you have layer twos or sidechains or like cross-chain systems, as a developer, you're still having to actually consider everything you're building in a way that writing web software 5 years ago, you didn't, right? If you're building a website, you don't really care how memory efficient it is, right? Whereas myself and a lot of developers, when we're building Compound or building systems like it, we're talking about how many writes there are in a given operation and how efficiently you can read information from a function and ways to pack storage together and like all of these things that building on any other technology, no developers would think about anymore. And you can be wasteful. If you somehow 100x'd the computation or storage capabilities of Ethereum, people might be more wasteful and they might write worse code and they might write applications that could be less efficient. But maybe that constraint is the sort of like thing that creates really strong applications that can live forever.
The constraint for sure forges the innovation. I think we have really, really fantastic evidence of 2018 when like nothing works and everyone's dead and why are you doing this, and coming out of that moment to really have a multi-asset class functional financial system is just mind-blowing. How do you think about the corollary sort of to that question around, Compound Gateway and the role of the L2s? And there's lots of conversation about splitting liquidity, reorganizing liquidity being the capital that goes into these various pools that power these functionalities. How multi-chain will the world be? What role will Compound play? And are there bridges or things that people should be thinking about now, or is that all still a hallucination?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, we're still as a society in a relatively early chapter of figuring out what the sort of structure of decentralized finance looks like on Ethereum and other blockchains and how it all interrelates. One thing that I feel strongly about is that there will be other ledgers that assets are issued on besides Ethereum. I see that as inevitable. And whether we like it or not, I do in some sense expect that there's going to be a multi-chain world. You can't convince someone to not issue an asset where they want. They're going to do it wherever it's cheapest or most efficient or most optimal for them, right? And so you're not ever going to get to an end state where every single asset is issued on the same ledger. I think we're already seeing that. And so I expect there to be many different ledgers where assets live and are sort of like originally issued. From there, it's a question of, do you build DeFi on one blockchain? Do you build DeFi on every blockchain? One of the things that Compound Labs, which originally built Compound, is doing is we're building a tool called Gateway, which tries to create one Compound-like interest rate market on top of multiple different blockchains. So instead of deploying a version of Compound on every blockchain where the liquidity would be local to that blockchain. So imagine if you deployed a Compound on Polkadot. It would just have the Polkadot assets. It would just have like DOT. It would just have maybe a stable coin that's native to it, but it would not be that interesting relative to the Compound on Ethereum. Gateway is a tool to make one interest rate market that spans all of the Ethereum assets and all of the assets from another blockchain. So you can have one functional market where you can earn interest rates on Ethereum assets. You can earn interest rates on Polkadot assets. You could use Ethereum assets as collateral to borrow Polkadot assets or vice versa. And instead of having one island of fractured liquidity on each blockchain, building one system that spans all of the blockchains. So extending the Compound that currently exists on Ethereum, which has $17 billion in it, to include assets natively from other chains and to meet other assets where that are natively issued. And this is the sort of future that I see unfolding. I think it's still going to be a very long journey. I think this is, like all things, an experiment, and it may succeed wildly or it may fail horrifically. And I think it's too early to call the ball game on how the market structure of crypto unfolds. It's still incredibly early. I think we might see very different approaches from centralized incumbents, financial institutions, central banks, et cetera. And that I think, as developers and investors and parts of the crypto economy, we have to be prepared for really many different sets of outcomes and approaches. And so my view is Gateway is a really exciting approach to build a larger compound to include additional assets, still being governed and run at the core from Ethereum. So I think it's really a lot of fun to see how it sort of plays out over the next couple of months and years. And, if you're listening to this, take a look at Gateway and follow in the progress.
It's a really cool moment right now in the industry because I feel like some of the core functionality has been defined and built. And of course, everything can always be better, but many of the main primitives are there. And so the decision making about the next phase of evolution is almost cloudier now than it was before, where you have a strong internal North Star about we've got to have borrowing and lending. And now that we do have borrowing and lending, now the question is about, okay, what's next? How does it connect to other ecosystems? How does it connect to traditional financial systems? How does it interoperate geographically? What kind of assets are you able to incorporate? What happens as different computational engines and different data engines launch? And it's almost the dimensionality of the uncertainty is in some ways going up and up, but then there are also a lot more resources that projects have to go and do lots of new experiments. So I definitely agree with you that it's hard to know what the ball game will be. And then it's likely to grow so wide that there are multiple games that people will play across different niches. I wanted to bring up two more ideas, and that is the kind of liquidity farming into governance conversation. And maybe we start there. So one of the innovations that really fueled the adoption and the kind of the capital influx into the protocol, which grew users, which grew assets, which grew attention, which grew users and assets, was the liquidity farming approaches of last year. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to make those decisions or think through how to do a token, how to incentivize people and kind of bring back incentive design into the game in a way that was beneficial to the community, that was ethical and kind of aligned with what you're trying to get done?
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we've done followed a playbook of progressive decentralization, where when we first launched Compound, we were terrified that it would have a bug in it and that we had to sort of be administratively in control at all moments to be able to react to a potential flaw in the protocol. And over time, moving that sort of like control, which is really based on fear, away from a team and into a broad community. So essentially going from an admin to a time lock to a full governance system. And that process really has played out with like, how do we be less and less in control of the system so that users can trust it more and more and more. And, I'll tangent really quickly and just say, like, when we first started off, one of the biggest concerns we had and that society had was whether or not a smart contract even could autonomously manage assets safely without being hacked. And, you have to appreciate that this is after the DAO. It's after two parity multi-sig bugs. Parity multi-sig was like the Gnosis multi-sig of its day. It's what everybody used. Nobody believed that you could safely autonomously manage assets. Everyone we talked to thought it was a bit of a pipe dream, and now it's taken for granted. But you have to appreciate that this is taken for granted today, but had to be proved through fire and fear from 2018 to 2019 to 2020. So the idea that you could even start off decentralized was crazy because, you couldn't necessarily even prove that the system was safe until it had been operating for a long period of time. So what we wanted to do was, as we became more and more confident that Compound was running safely and without a bug that would have to be reacted to in 4 seconds, move control out. And so a lot of the things that we were doing in this progressive decentralization were being done for the first time. Compound in a lot of ways was having to sort of like create this playbook in public in real time. So we went from an admin
to a time lock. And now the time lock contract is like one of the most commonly forked contracts on Ethereum. It's great. Everyone uses it. To a full on-chain governance system that operates without any team or middleman. So it's designed to be true, fully one end of the spectrum, on-chain direct ownership and governance of a protocol without, requiring a team or a foundation or a middleman to do anything for you. So it's really radical decentralization. And we're doing all of this for the first time. And so when we decided that we wanted to move to full and direct on-chain governance, we were scared, just like we were scared when we first launched Compound. When we first launched Compound, we were scared that there would be a technical flaw. When we first launched governance, we were scared that there would be, one, a technical flaw, but two, a governance flaw. And we wanted there to be a very smooth on-ramp to a system in which anyone in the community could propose changes to a live functioning system with lots of assets in it. So a lot of people forget this, but we actually launched it with on-chain governance, but without a distribution of tokens to users. So we tested it essentially as a team and with the early investors in Compound, in public, on-chain, but only with people that were semi-trusted with tokens to manage an on-chain system. So, you can think of it like moving to like a super mega multi-sig with many different token holders essentially playing this role of on-chain governance, not off-chain voting, on-chain control of the protocol with millions and billions of dollars. And so after we were confident that the on-chain governance system that we had built was functioning correctly, that we had piloted multiple different proposals that worked, that upgraded the protocol, that changed parameters, that we were confident that the system was functional, we decided to distribute tokens to users. And what was interesting about this is, again, there was no real playbook for this. We were doing it for the first time. And so our thought process was that the way to bring users into the process was to distribute tokens to them based on their usage going forward. And even this was considered radical at the time because this is not something that teams were really actively doing yet. But we thought it was a great way to increase the number of token holders to be the number of users of Compound at that moment. And that was really exciting and important to us. And there was not a term for liquidity mining or yield farming yet. When we did this, there was some centralized exchanges that were doing liquidity farming like things with like trade rebates and like liquidity mining. They all ended in spectacular failure. So we actually didn't even think that this was like yield farming. We thought it was like, hey, how do we make every single user a token holder? Very quickly, the community sort of came up with a name for it and started calling it yield farming, started like pricing the tokens. And we very quickly said like, oh, maybe we should even like show how many tokens you're getting in the interface and like show what the quote yield is from these tokens. But like when we launched it, we didn't anticipate that users would like monetize it so directly. And we didn't have any of the tools to even display the sort of like economics of this to users. I mean, it caught us off guard and has really become like a framework for many other teams in the space now to distribute tokens to users for free. So it's really interesting how it evolved. And I think there's going to be continued improvements to that model. There's already been huge improvements. I think if I could go back in time, I would have done it a little bit differently, but I'm very happy with how it's gone so far.
There are some fascinating themes in how you describe the journey. I think we've talked about the importance of constraint and the importance of fear, whether it's fear of letting go of the code and the admin keys or fear of the incorrect approach to governance. And it's almost like the environment and what the environment provides that shapes the type of outcome that you're able to create. And out of it, you've been able to lay really the rails and the foundation for this new ecosystem. So thank you so much for taking us through these ideas and through your journey. If our listeners want to check out Compound and learn more about the protocol as well as learn more about you, where should they go?
Yeah. So if you're interested in Compound, there's really two places to go. One is compound.finance and the other is compound.cash. Compound.finance is for all of the existing markets on Ethereum, and compound.cash is for the gateway bridge that's being built. And you can follow Compound Finance on Twitter and R. Leshner on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.